Doctors declared the Korean Mafia boss brain dead, until the black waitress took his hand and refused to let go. Doctors declared Han Seo-jun brain dead before midnight. By sunrise, his empire had already started moving without him. His council whispered about succession. His enemies waited outside the hospital gates. His family spoke about signatures, assets, and control. But they made one mistake. They did not know a black waitress in a rain-soaked uniform was about to walk into that ICU, take his hand, and refuse to let go. The ICU on the 4th floor of Seoul Central Hospital is a cold place. Not just in temperature, cold in the way a room feels, when everyone inside it has already stopped hoping. The machines were still working. Beeping, breathing, pushing life through tubes. But the people had already made their peace with the outcome. I knew that kind of cold. I had felt it before, standing in a different hospital room, holding my mother's hand while strangers with clipboards talked past me like I wasn't there. Han Seo-jun was lying in that bed the way no one who knew him would ever have imagined. Still, pale beneath the fluorescent light. His chest rose and fell only because a machine told it to. The most feared Korean Mafia boss in Seoul, the man whose name could empty a room faster than a gunshot, lay helpless, wired to monitors, with no empire left to command. Dr. Evelyn Mercer had delivered the verdict carefully, the way doctors do when they want the words to land gently but still land. No meaningful brain activity. The brain is not responding to stimulation. We are maintaining his body, but there is no indication that he will wake. Outside that room, his counsel had already taken the news and turned it into a transaction. Chairman Baek Do-yeon stood at the end of the hallway in a charcoal suit that cost more than my car. He was not crying. He was speaking in a low, deliberate voice to two men I didn't recognize, his hands folded in front of him, like he was conducting a board meeting. To his left, Kang Min-ho, Seo-jun's second-in-command, the man who had stood beside him for a decade, leaned against the wall with his phone in his hand, scrolling. The man who was supposed to be his most loyal lieutenant was scrolling through his phone while Seo-jun lay on the other side of that glass. I stood at the end of the corridor, in my waitress uniform, rain still dripping from my jacket, smelling like coffee grounds and grease from the late shift. Security stopped me before I even reached the door. "This is family business," Chairman Baek said, looking at me the way people look at something that wandered in from the street. "Restaurant staff have no place here." Kang Min-ho glanced up from his long enough to nod at security. "Remove her." I did not raise my voice. I had learned a long time ago that the quieter you speak in a room that's already dismissed you, the more unsettling it becomes. "Then let me say goodbye," I said. They looked at each other, amused, dismissive. "Let me hold his hand," I said. "That's all I'm asking." Everyone in that hallway told me, with their eyes before their mouths even opened, that it would not matter, that I was wasting their time and mine. But Nurse Grace Holloway, who had been standing quietly near the station, met my eyes. She gave me a small nod. She held the ICU door open. I walked in. I took his hand, and the monitor changed. One small line on the screen shifted. His heart rate moved. His finger, just one finger, twitched against my palm. Dr. Mercer stopped speaking mid-sentence. She turned toward the monitor, then toward me. "Nurse," Grace whispered. That wasn't there before. Nobody celebrated. Nobody understood it yet. But the room changed. And that was the moment every powerful man in that hallway realized the woman they called nobody might be the only reason Han Seo-jun was still alive. My name is Naomi Hartwell. I am a waitress at a 24-hour diner called Miso and Magnolia on the south end of Itaewon. I work the closing shift. I smell like coffee and short-order smoke most nights when I take the bus home. I send money to my mother, Gloria, back in Atlanta every second week. I wear the same 3 pairs of shoes in rotation. I am nobody's idea of someone who belongs in a story like this. But here is the truth about Han Seo-jun that his empire would never say out loud. He was never just a story about power. He was a story about loneliness wearing power like a disguise. I had known him for 11 months before he ended up in that hospital bed. Long enough to see through the disguise. Not long enough to stop being afraid of what I saw underneath. "Doctor," Mercer briefed the council formally the morning after his accident. I stood at the back of the room, still not officially allowed to be there, surviving on Nurse Grace's quiet mercy, and the fact that no one had physically carried me out yet. The brain scan results were projected on a screen. Dr. Mercer pointed to the dark spaces where activity should have been present. She used words like hypoxic damage and non-responsive cortex and prolonged unconsciousness. She was precise and professional and entirely without comfort. Han Seo-jun, she said, controlled half of Seoul's underground economy. He moved through the city like a current, invisible, powerful, felt in everything. He was the man no enemy dared challenge directly. The man whose silence in a negotiation was more threatening than another man's raised voice. The man who had rebuilt his father's broken empire from the ground up with nothing but discipline and the kind of coldness that comes from learning too early that warmth is a vulnerability. And now he was lying in a hospital bed, unable to move, speak, threaten, or protect himself. The contrast was not lost on me. I had seen his hands still a room full of dangerous men with one gesture. Now those same hands lay open on white sheets, undefended. I stayed. They didn't wait 12 hours. I overheard Chairman Baek Do-yun and Kang Min-ho in the small conference room near the nurses' station that afternoon. The door was cracked. I didn't think they noticed me refilling the water cooler in the hallway, because men like that almost never notice women like me. Emergency transfer of operational control needs to be documented before the week ends, Chairman Baek said. His voice was unhurried, calm. Like this was a routine quarterly discussion. I've already spoken to Wu and Park, Kang Min-ho replied. They're prepared to shift loyalty if the situation doesn't resolve. Shift loyalty. As though Seo-jun were a currency that had lost its value overnight. The Gangnam holdings need to be insulated before the Busan Group moves on them, Baek continued. If Sejun remains in this condition beyond 30 days, the emergency succession clause activates. We need to be positioned. Positioned, that was the word that turned my stomach. They were not grieving, they were positioning. Kang Min-ho said something that made it worse. The only wild card is the woman. She apparently got into the ICU last night. Grace Holloway let her through. A pause. She's a waitress, Chairman Baek said flatly. Handle it. I pressed myself back against the wall. My hands were cold. Not from fear. I had felt fear before, and this was not it. This was something closer to fury, the kind that settles deep in your chest and burns slow and clean. I looked through the ICU window at Seo-jun. His chest still rose and fell. The machines still worked. The men who were supposed to stand beside him were already dividing his life up like an estate sale. I went back inside and took his hand again. I was not dressed like wealth. I was in my uniform, dark green with the diner logo over the pocket. And my shoes were still damp from the night before. My hair had gone flat from the rain and I hadn't slept. I looked exactly like what they believed I was. A waitress who had wandered into a situation that was above her station. Chairman Baek approached me directly the next morning. He was polite in the way that people are polite when they're used to getting what they want without raising their voice. Miss Hartwell, he said. He had learned my name, which meant he had asked someone. This is not a place for restaurant staff. I understand you may have a personal attachment, but you are creating a disturbance. I am sitting quietly beside a man holding his hand, I said. That is not a disturbance. You have no legal right to be here. No, I said. I don't. He waited for me to continue. When I didn't, he recalibrated. We can make this arrangement comfortable for you. Financially, I mean. Whatever your relationship to Seo-jun, he is my friend, I said, not an investment, and I don't want your money. He looked at me the way you look at a door that won't open despite the correct key, confused, mildly offended. Nurse Grace caught my eye from across the room and gave me the smallest nod. She had seen men like Baek before. She had also, I suspected, seen women like me before. Women who were not allowed to belong in a room but stayed anyway. She believed I should be here. I wasn't sure yet if she was right. But I wasn't leaving. Dr. Mercer was not unkind. She was simply scientific, the way all the best doctors are. Honest first, gentle second. When I asked her formally if I could remain at Seo-jun's bedside, she looked at me for a long moment. I want to be clear, she said. In cases of this severity, familiar voices and touch, can sometimes be incorporated into stimulation protocols. We have no strong clinical evidence that it produces recovery. It may provide him with no meaningful experience at all. Then it will cost you nothing, I said. She studied me. Then she stepped aside. I sat beside him. I wrapped both hands around his and held on. Nothing happened for the first several minutes. The room was quiet except for the machines. Chairman Bake's men were visible through the glass, watching. Kang Min-ho had his arms crossed. I was not praying exactly. I was talking to him the way I had learned to talk to him. Low, steady, without performing emotion. "Seo-jun," I said. "It's Naomi. I'm here." The monitor shifted, not dramatically, not like in the movies. Just a small change in the pattern, a variance that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago. His finger moved against my palm. Not much, less than a tremor, but deliberate, present. Dr. Mercer crossed the room in 4 steps. She stood over the monitor. She did not speak. Nurse Grace was at my shoulder. "That wasn't there before," she said softly. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Kang Min-ho knocked on the glass. "If you have ever stayed when everyone else walked away, subscribe right now. Because what happened after I held his hand was not science, not luck, and not something his enemies were ready for. Let me tell you who Han Seo-jun was to me before that hospital room. He first came into Miso and Magnolia about 11 months ago. Always the same booth. The one in the back corner with the view of both the door and the window. Always after midnight. Always alone. Black coffee, no food. Sometimes for 2 hours at a stretch. He sat the way men sit when they are always listening for something. I was afraid of him at first. You would have been too. There was something about the way the room changed when he walked in. A subtle drop in noise. A collective held breath. That told you without words who he was and what that meant. But he was never rude to me. He was quiet, careful. He asked for nothing extra. He tipped more than the bill. And once, when I came in for the closing shift to find my manager yelling at me in the parking lot for a scheduling mistake that wasn't mine, he was sitting in his car at the edge of the lot. He didn't say anything. He just waited until my manager went back inside. Later, Nurse Grace would tell me that 2 of Seo-jun's men had been stationed near the diner on late nights for months. I had never noticed them. Then there was my mother, Gloria. She had been ill the previous winter, a hospital stay that lasted 3 weeks, bills that were going to take me years to manage. I had applied for everything, was working extra shifts, was doing the math every night before sleep. Then one morning, the billing office called to say an anonymous payment had cleared the entire balance. I did not put it together immediately. It was Jang Yun-woo, weeks later, who confirmed it. Seo-jun had found out about my mother's situation. I still don't know how, and paid her bill without telling me. Not as a gesture, not for leverage, quietly. Because he could and because she mattered to someone he quietly watched over. He had never told me any of this. He sat in that booth and drank his coffee and sometimes asked, "How is your mother?" With a casualness that I now understand was not casual at all. There was one more thing. A few months before the accident, a man had followed me from the bus stop 3 nights in a row. I hadn't told anyone. I had been too tired, too worn down to explain it to a police officer who would probably tell me I was imagining it. On the 4th night, the man wasn't there. He was never there again. I found out months later from Jang that Seo-jun had quietly handled it the same week it started. He never mentioned it. He never asked for gratitude. He just made sure I was safe and went back to his coffee. He protected me from the world. Without knowing it, without planning it, I had been protecting the human part of him. The part that still wanted to sit in a diner booth at midnight and pretend the Empire wasn't real. The part that asked about my mother because he genuinely wanted to know the answer. The part that smiled at a story about decaf and immediately went back to looking like he never smiled at all. He had once told me, in that low voice he used when the pretense fell away for a moment, "People fear me because it is easier than knowing me." I had thought about that sentence for months. Now, sitting beside his hospital bed, I thought about it differently. He hadn't been explaining himself. He had been asking a question. He had been asking whether I was afraid of him too. My answer, it turned out, was the reason I was still in that room. My mother Gloria called me on the 2nd night. I was in the waiting area, wrapped in the thin hospital blanket Nurse Grace had found for me. "Baby," she said, "you need to eat something. I had something." "A granola bar from a vending machine is not something," I laughed. It was small and tired and real. "Mama," I said, "he has no one. His people are in that hospital, talking about his money, his business, everything he built, and not one of them is in there with him." She was quiet for a moment. Gloria Hartwell did not waste words on things that weren't worth saying. "Baby," she said finally, "sometimes God sends you to a room not because you can fix everything, but because someone in that room needs one person who refuses to leave. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing a person can do." I held on to that. I thought about why I stayed. I had asked myself that honestly, in the long hours when the hall was quiet and the machines kept their rhythm. I did not stay because he was powerful. Power had nothing to do with it. I stayed because I had watched him sit alone at that booth, night after night, drinking his coffee with a kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with being tired and everything to do with being unseen. I had watched him ask about my mother and listen, actually listen, when I answered. I had watched him smile once, just once, when I told him a ridiculous story about a customer who complained that the decaf tasted too awake. It was small and brief and gone in a second, but it was real. I had told him once, "Maybe you keep choosing rooms full of people who only know how to want and fear." He had looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe I do." That conversation had stayed with him. I know that now. I stayed because no one in that hospital, not one person in his empire, was in that room calling him by his name. Not his title. Not boss. Not chairman. Not Mafia king. Just his name. Someone had to. On the third day, Chairman Bake escalated. He brought a legal advisor. A thin man who spoke in rapid Korean and handed Dr. Mercer a document I couldn't read but understood the shape of. He spoke about patient privacy, about authorized next of kin, about the disruption of medical protocol. Dr. Mercer read the document. She looked at me. Then she looked at Nurse Grace. Nurse Grace said, simply. He responded to her voice. He responded to her touch. "That hasn't happened with anyone else." "That is anecdotal," Kang Min-ho said from the doorway. He had finally come into the room, which told me he was now taking this seriously enough to be present. "It doesn't establish any legal standing." "You can remove me from the room," I said. "You cannot remove the fact that he responded to me." Chairman Bake looked at me with cold patience. "You have no legal right to be here, Miss Hartwell. None. And I will not stand by while a waitress disrupts the management of a serious medical situation for— What exactly? What is it you think you are accomplishing?" I stood up from that chair slowly. I was tired and my back ached, and I had been wearing the same clothes for 3 days, and I did not care about any of that. "Maybe nothing," I said. "But everyone in this room with legal right was already dividing his life while his hand was still warm. So I'll take my chances with the approach that's actually getting a response." The room was silent. Nurse Grace cleared her throat softly. "Doctor," Mercer said, "the patient has shown neurological responses that we did not observe prior to Miss Hartwell's presence. Until I have a clinical explanation for that, I am not comfortable restricting access." Chairman Bake left without another word, but he was not finished. I stopped counting the days at some point. The doctors called him brain dead, his council called him a liability, his empire called him gone. But I was just a black waitress in a soaked uniform who had refused to leave, holding the hand of a Korean mafia boss everyone else had already buried. And I was the only one in that room calling him by his name. I slept in the chair beside his bed. Nurse Grace brought me food. She claimed was leftover from the staff lounge. I held his hand for hours at a stretch. I talked to him the way you talk to someone you trust, not performing hope, not pretending I wasn't scared, just talking. I told him about the diner, about the new cook who kept burning the short-order eggs, and the regulars who pretended not to notice out of loyalty. I told him about my mother's garden in Atlanta, how she grew herbs on her back porch and talked to them like they could hear her. I told him that her kitchen always smelled like rosemary and gumbo and clean laundry, and that it was the safest smell in the world. I told him about the night we met. How I almost spilled an entire pot of coffee on him during his second visit because my hands were shaking from a bad day, and he had looked up at me and said nothing, just moved his cup slightly to the right so I had room to set the pot down safely. Such a small thing, such a careful, quiet thing. I had thought about that gesture for weeks afterward and never understood why until I was sitting in this room watching machines breathe for him, understanding that a man who moved his coffee cup to protect a tired waitress was not the same man his empire believed him to be. I wiped his hands with a warm cloth the way my mother had taught me, gently, one finger at a time, as though care was something you demonstrated in the small details. I called him Seo-jun, not boss. Not chairman. Not the name people whispered with their heads down, just his name. The name his mother had given him before any of the empire existed. You do not get to leave me in a room full of people who only loved your power. I told him once, very quietly, in the dark hour before the night shift changed. I am not asking you to come back for them. I am asking you to come back as yourself. Just the man. That's enough for me. The monitor ran its steady line. I held on. And no matter who stood outside that glass waiting for me to break, I refused to let go. The responses grew, Doctor. Mercer documented each one carefully, cautiously, with the discipline of someone who had learned not to offer hope before evidence. But the evidence was accumulating. His finger moved again, this time with clear intention, curling around mine when I spoke his name. His breathing deepened and shifted when I talked. His heart rate settled into a slower, calmer rhythm in the hours I was present versus the hours I was not. Nurse Grace kept the logs. She brought them to Dr. Mercer without comment, just the facts. Then his eyelid trembled. Dr. Mercer ordered new tests. She reviewed the latest scans with a colleague she called in from another hospital. She did not share the results with the council first. She shared them with Nurse Grace, who stood at my elbow and said quietly, "The new scans look different from the first ones." Different, that was the word she used. Not better, not miraculous, just different. The council panicked quietly, which is the most dangerous kind of panic. I watched Kang Min-ho make 3 phone calls in the span of an hour, walking tight circles in the hallway. Chairman Baek arrived with 2 new lawyers. They wanted Si-jun transferred to a private facility, one they controlled, where access would be entirely at their discretion. That was the moment I understood what they were actually afraid of. It was Nurse Grace who came to me at 2 in the morning, her voice low and careful. "I heard them talking," she said. "They're trying to execute an emergency directive. Legal documents that assign power of medical and business decision-making to Chairman Baek in the event Seo-jun remains incapacitated past a threshold date. They've apparently had them prepared since before he was even admitted. I let that sit with me. There's something else, Grace said. They've been moving assets. Bank transfers. Holdings in his name being quietly restructured. They're not waiting to see if he wakes up. They're building the reality where he doesn't matter either way." I called the only name I had. I had found the number in an old message Seo-jun once showed me without explanation, saying only, "If anything ever happens and you need someone you can trust, use this." I had thought it was an odd thing to say. I understood it now. Jang Hyun-woo answered on the second ring. He had been pushed out of Seo-jun's circle by Kang Min-ho 8 months ago. A quiet, engineered removal that at the time had looked like a retirement. He arrived at the hospital within 3 hours. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with steady eyes and the manner of someone who had spent decades watching for threats, so his principal didn't have to. He suspected, Jang told me, sitting beside me in the waiting room at 5 in the morning. Before the accident, he had started asking me to document things, quietly. He knew something had shifted with Min-ho. He had hidden copies of certain records with me. I think he was protecting himself. I think he was also protecting you. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course he was. The room was very quiet. Jang had secured the documents. Dr. Mercer had the medical evidence. Nurse Grace stood at the door. The council's legal team had been held up by a procedural challenge Jang had filed with the hospital administration. It wouldn't hold them long, but it was enough. I sat beside him. I was exhausted in every bone. My voice had gone rough from days of talking to someone who hadn't answered. I held his hand in both of mine. I leaned forward. "I have to tell you something," I said. "I know why you sat in that booth every night. I know why you asked about my mother. I know what you did for her, and I know about the men you posted near the diner. You protected me from things I didn't even know were coming, and you never told me, and I think that's the most like yourself you have ever been." I stopped, breathed. "You once told me people only stayed near you because they feared you. I stayed because I saw you, the real you, not the empire, not the reputation, not what they all needed you to be. Just the man who drinks black coffee at midnight and gets tired when he thinks no one is watching." I felt the tears then, finally, after days of holding them back. I let them come. "So if there is any part of you still in there, Han Se-jun, come back as the man, not the empire. I don't need the empire, I just need you." His hand tightened around mine, not a reflex. Not a tremor, a grip, deliberate, certain. His eyes opened, I did not move, I could not speak. The monitors reacted immediately. "Doctor." Mercer was already in the room before I registered she had come in. Nurse Grace had her hands pressed over her mouth. He looked at the ceiling first, then slowly, with the enormous effort of a man pulling himself back from somewhere very far away, he turned his head. He looked at me. His voice was barely there, rough and low and real. "You stayed." I held his hand tighter. "You came back." He was weak. He could barely move his head. His voice was a thread of what it had been. But he was there. Fully, unmistakably there. His eyes clear, his mind present. That same careful attention he had always given the room now focused entirely on me. Chairman Baek and Kang Min-ho arrived within the hour. They came in performing relief, embracing staff members, expressing gratitude to the doctors, speaking about miraculous recoveries and God's mercy with mouths that had been dividing assets not 12 hours before. Then Baek looked at me and said to the security guard beside him, "Please escort Miss Hartwell out now. Seo-jun needs his people around him." Seo-jun's fingers tightened around mine. Slowly, with visible effort, he turned his eyes to the guard, then to Kang Min-ho, then to Chairman Baek. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every word landed. "Touch her," he said, "and you lose everything." The room froze, not because he was loud, not because he was threatening, but because even in that hospital bed, in that weakened body, with machines still attached to his arms, the thing that made Han-shun who he was had returned fully intact, and everyone in that room recognized it. His first use of his returned power was not to reclaim his empire, it was to protect the woman who had stayed. Jang delivered the documents to Seo-jun's bedside the following day. It took Seo-jun another week to be strong enough to hold them, but he read every page. I sat beside him while he did. His face was still, that controlled, unreadable stillness I had once found frightening and now found deeply familiar. The evidence was complete. Kang Min-ho had moved 11 separate asset transfers in the days Seo-jun was unconscious. Chairman Baek had prepared and notarized succession documents before the accident, which meant the planning had predated Seo-jun's hospitalization, which meant the accident itself warranted deeper investigation. 3 council members had held private meetings with rival organizations during the same period, and they had tried to remove me because I was the only proof that Seo-jun was still responding. As long as I was in that room, there was a chance he would come back. A chance was the one thing they could not afford. Seo-jun handled it without theatrics. That was always his way. The same quiet authority that had built the empire was now dismantling the betrayal piece by piece. Kang Min-ho was removed from his position via a single document, signed and witnessed. Chairman Baek's legal authority over any of Seo-jun's holdings was voided by the evidence of his premature succession preparations. The other council members were addressed individually, privately, in the way that Seo-jun had always addressed things that needed to be resolved without noise. No violence, no spectacle, just the end of their influence, documented and permanent. I watched the same men who had called me nobody lower their eyes when Seo-jun said my name. 3 weeks after he woke up, Seo-jun was moved out of the ICU and into a private recovery room. A month after that, he was well enough for the kind of conversation that required honesty rather than survival. He asked me to sit with him. Just us. And Jiang standing quietly by the door the way Jiang always stood. Present. Steady, unnecessary to acknowledge. "I want to tell you something clearly," Seo-jun said. He was thinner than he'd been, his voice still slightly rougher than before, but his eyes were the same, careful, seeing. "I will not repay loyalty with ownership," he said. "I will not turn what you gave me into a contract or a reward. You are not something I can purchase." He paused. "But if you choose to stand beside me, knowing what I am, knowing what the Empire is, knowing all of it, the world will know you are not beneath anyone in my life." I looked at him for a moment. "I didn't stay for your empire," I said. He nodded, slowly. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. "I know," he said. "That is why I trust you with the part of me that survived it." In the weeks after Seo-jun's recovery, I noticed something shift in the hallways of the hospital, and then in the world beyond them. Chairman Bake's former men, the security guards who had blocked the ICU door, the assistants who had stood at his shoulder and looked through me like glass, no longer looked through me. The next time I passed one of them in the hospital corridor, he stepped aside. Not because I asked, not because anyone told him to. He simply lowered his eyes and moved. I did not feel triumph. I felt something quieter than that. A kind of settling, the acknowledgement of something that had always been true, but had taken a great deal of pain to make visible. Seo-jun had said my name once in a room full of powerful men, and the Empire had finally learned how to hear it. 2 months later, on a Tuesday night in October, a black car parked outside Miso and Magnolia. The diner was half full. The night cook had finally stopped burning the eggs. The overhead lights were doing that thing they always do in autumn, going gold instead of white. The door opened and the room changed. It always did when he walked in. The slight collective pause, the awareness of who had entered and what that meant. Han Seo-jun walked to the back corner booth. The same one. He sat down with his coat, still on the way he used to, and he looked at the menu the way a man's looks at something familiar that still brings him quiet comfort. I came to his table, set down a glass of water. He placed his hand on the table, palm up, open, not commanding, not transacting, asking. No ICU, no monitors, no machines breathing for him. No council watching from hallways, no empire hovering over the moment. Just his hand on a diner table in the gold light, reaching toward me. I took it. They called him brain dead. They called me nobody. But when the whole empire walked away from the man, I held his hand, and somehow he found his way back. If this story touched you, drop your city in the comments and tell me. Would you stay beside someone everyone else had already given up on? Subscribe for more emotional Korean mafia boss love stories. More is coming. Stay with me.